Hello and welcome to another episode of Let's Argue About Plants, the podcast for people that love plants, but not always the same ones. I'm Carol Collins. I'm Associate Editor at Fine Gardening Magazine, and today I am joined by Uli Lorimer, who is the Director of the Native Plant Tust in Framingham, Massachusetts. Welcome to the podcast, Uli.
Pleased to be here. Thank you.
We have been doing these interviews since the beginning of the year, and we are going to try something a little new. We've heard from our regular listeners that when we do the interviews, they kind of miss the plant discovery portion of the podcast that Danielle and I usually do. So Uli is our first person who will be doing a little plant discovery. So we're going to do a segment where we cover 4 high-impact native plants. And he seemed like the perfect person to cover this topic for us. So what's your first high-impact native plant that you would offer to our listeners, please?
So the first one is a longtime favorite of mine, and that is called narrow-leaved mountain mint, or Pycnanthemum tenuifolium. Mountain mints in general have a great reputation as being pollinator magnets, particularly in the summertime, so they've got great wildlife value. But some of the species out there can be a little bit too exuberant in their growth for some gardeners. And I really like tenuifolium because it's more well behaved and tends to stay in place, makes a clump that gets a little bit bigger and bigger every year. It's very highly adaptable in terms of the kinds of conditions. It is naturally found as far deep in south as Texas and Nebraska, and pretty much covers the entire eastern part of the United States and into Canada. So you know that it's cold hardy. It can certainly be very drought tolerant, and I think it's just a really attractive plant in all seasons. It has fine foliage, kind of reminds you of rosemary in a way, sort of dark green and very narrow. Summertime is when the flowers are featured, and you'll see a bounty of flying insects drawn to it, not just bees, but wasps and beetles and butterflies and all sorts of things. But I particularly like it if you leave the stems up in the wintertime. The seed heads stay on nice stout stems, and they're this beautiful steel gray, like little buttons of steel gray that add some winter interest as well. And if you ever need a reminder of summertime, particularly in the winter, you take one of those little seed heads and you squish it in your fingers, and you have this really wonderful minty aroma that reminds you of warmer days. So that would be my number one choice right now.
Very cool. How big does it get?
It grows to about 2 feet, maybe 2.5 feet. If you grow it in poor soils, it may be shorter. So it's another good reason why it's not something that gets too tall. It's not going to flop over. And like I say, it stays put, which is a nice kind of plant to have sometimes.
Very cool. I think that Pycnanthemum muticum is that's the plant of the year from, I think, at least one or two, maybe a perennial plant association. How does it differ from muticum?
So muticum has broader leaves, and right before it flowers, it features these sort of silvery bracts that sort of subtend the flower itself. They're about equivalent in terms of height. Muticum grows maybe a little bit taller, but the main difference is that if muticum's really happy, it's going to spread itself through a lot of underground rhizomes. They're members of the mint family, and so they do have that reputation, like other mints, particularly the culinary mints, that once you plant them, expect them to keep showing up in other places in the garden. And that's one of the reasons I really like the narrow-leafed one, is that it's not nearly as aggressive when it spreads underground as muticum can be.
Excellent. Okay, that's a great pointer, because I do think some people shy away from the mountain mints because they're afraid that it's going to be like the culinary mint that they're used to.
Yeah, and that's why I would recommend everybody give this one a try, because it's much more well behaved.
Excellent. All right. Well, that's a great first plant. Are all of your plants perennials, or do you have some other types of plants?
So I have 2 perennials and then 2 trees.
Oh,
So
excellent.
we'll stick with the theme of perennials. And my second plant for high impact and high, I think, visual impact and good wildlife value is going to be the Turk's cap lily. So Lilium superbum. And I think this is just one of the most spectacular lilies of the East, similarly distributed all throughout the southeastern and just getting into southern New England as its natural range. This is a stately and just very elegant lily. Can grow up to 6 to 8 feet tall if it's happy. It does like consistently moist soils. And it features these beautiful sort of fiery red orange petals that are what are called reflexive, so they peel all the way back and create the shape of a turban or a Turk's cap, which is where it gets its name from. It's a favorite of swallowtail butterflies, and it's just such a stunning plant that the minute people lay eyes on it, they want to know what it is and how they can grow it themselves. So that's my second choice for high impact. Great for pollinators and just a showstopper in the summer when it blooms.
If I have always wanted this one, but I have been afraid of the deer nipping the heads off. Do it to this lily too, like they do to all the other ones?
Sadly, they do. And so my choice should come with a little asterisk, because if you do have deer pressure, which I'd say most people do, this is one that's worth trying to use some of the distasteful sprays or maybe even some physical enclosures to get it to grow. It's one of these plants that, and I wonder here whether these are the kind of things that will end up being more successful in gardens than they will be in natural spaces, because nobody's out there to put a fence around it in the woods or along the stream side. As long as there's a balance between deer and predators of deer, you can have healthy numbers of it. But if that is not the case, we are seeing these becoming increasingly less common out in the wild. But all the more reason why I think you should include them in gardens if you can, because we can keep them alive and enjoy them in that way.
Absolutely. Worth putting inside the deer fencing, for sure.
Absolutely.
Excellent.
So my third choice is a tree, and it's called the cucumber magnolia. This is Magnolia acuminata. And so this is a really beautiful tall shade tree. It has large foliage, not as large as like big leaf magnolia or umbrella magnolia, but large enough to have a really good bold texture in the garden. The flowers that emerge in early summer are beautiful white and very pleasantly fragrant. It's another good reason to have it and let that aroma waft over you on warm summer evenings. The fruit are produced later on and turn the sort of beautiful red color before the seeds are dispersed. Its range is again about east of the Mississippi and just getting into New York, New Jersey. It's not quite fully native in New England, but it is certainly hardy and not to be too New England centric, but if you're ever up at the Arnold Arboretum, they have some spectacular specimens, over 100-year-old trees that are just gorgeous to look at. So this one for me is for that sort of bolder texture and beautiful fragrance, and just deserves to be used a little bit more in the landscape.
How large does it get? Like that 100-year-old one?
Over 100 feet, 90 feet,
Yeah.
100 feet at maturity, and depends on how it's grown. If you give it space, it can have a nice spreading crown, have a nice shape. If it's grown in a more of a wooded situation, then it'll probably end up being a little skinnier because it has to share that space with other trees.
Makes sense. Well, excellent. So that's three
That's
down,
three.
one more to
Yes,
go.
and so my final choice is an oak. And I think oaks, because they're keystone species, they have really tremendous wildlife value, and so I'm going to choose white oak, Quercus alba. This is one of the more slow-growing oak species, but it is exceptionally long-lived. There are, wonderful specimens throughout the Northeast and the Southeast that are 300, 400 years old. So, they have that capability. Scientists have identified over 100 species of mammals and birds that feed on the acorns, and Dr. Doug Tallamy's research has shown that oaks as a genus support over 500 species of moths and butterflies as caterpillars. So there's just so much going on in oak trees, and I think you really can't be disappointed in terms of planting those. And I think it's also a nod towards the future. Many folks might plant a small white oak now, knowing that perhaps their children or their grandchildren will see it into its full glory. It has economic value as well, sometimes called stave oak because it was used to make barrels. White oak is also part of the timber industry, so we just had a beautiful boardwalk put in here at Garden in the Woods that features white oak decking, very attractive. So a really useful tree, aside just from enjoying it and providing all those resources for wildlife. So that'll be my my number 4 high impact native species to round off the list.
Excellent. Do you happen to know, so there's red oak and there's white oak. Is it referring to the color of the wood or some other feature of the tree?
So they're sort of broad groups that they were created to help with identification of oaks. So we have a lot of oak species in the United States. In fact, the Center for Oak Diversity is just south of us in Mexico. So there are ones that, they grow in the deserts and the mountains up there. But to your question, the white oak group refers to oaks that have leaves with rounded lobes. And so the red oak group, the vasculature, so the veins extend beyond the edge of the leaf and they appear like little bristles in the lobes. And so what they call the red oak group are ones that when you pick up the leaf you can see the little bristles, the very ends of those secondary and tertiary veins that are inside of the leaves. And that helps people trying to figure out what oak they're looking at, narrow down the possible options. What doesn't help, of course, is that oaks are very promiscuous and they hybridize with one another a lot. And so if you're struggling to identify the oak that you might have growing in your forest or in your garden, don't feel bad. They can be very difficult, particularly if you're looking at something that's a hybrid between 2 different species and has characters of both that are present. But that shouldn't prevent you from enjoying them anyway.
Excellent. And yes, and I think of your 4, this is probably your most high impact because A, it gets big, and B, it has such incredible ecological value. So
yeah,
excellent.
Absolutely. That's, I think, really the definition of a keystone species is something that has an outsized role that it plays within the ecosystem in terms of all of the life that it supports.
Yes, excellent. Well, that was a great list. And for those of you that are listening, we'll have photos of these plants online, finegardening.com. Just click on the podcast tab and all the information. If you didn't write down the plant name or anything that will also be there on the website. So now that we have done the plant discovery section, we can get into the interview. And we've been starting each of these interviews by asking our guests about your background and what was it that brought you into a life of studying and working with plants.
So for me, I think I have to pay credit to 2 very important women in my life, my mother and my mom's mom, so my grandmother, both of whom had really wonderful gardens. And some of my earliest memories, particularly with my grandmother who lived in Germany, she invited me every evening in the summer to join her on her nightly pest control walks. And specifically what this was we were equipped with a small pail and a trowel. and we went around the garden and we would find slugs, and we would chop them in half with a trowel and put them into the pail, and then add that to the compost when we were done. And it was just a really wonderful bonding experience to walk around the garden, and I would ask about what is this plant and what is this, and it was a really fond memory. My mom similarly had a really wonderful garden growing up, and not surprisingly, when it came times to divide the chores between my sister and I got to do all the outside stuff, and my sister was asked to do more of the inside stuff. And so I just kind of really loved it. I was that kid that wanted to turn over the log and see what was underneath of it. And looking back, I do feel very fortunate to have grown up in a place where I had access to a garden, where I had access to a little patch of woods and a little brook that went through it, and so I could spend my my hours alone investigating. And so I do feel like that definitely helped. I grew up in Wilmington, Delaware, and we visited Longwood Gardens a lot when I was younger. And so I like to think that early exposure to a really world-class botanical institution had a formative experience for me in shaping where I would go. And then, as I got older, I really thought, well, a career in gardening makes sense. Everybody wants to have a garden, and so my initial plan had been to have my own landscape business. And I worked in some nurseries, and I realized that at the time everybody kind of sold the same 50 plants, and it wasn't very exciting. And I thought, well, where can I go to be exposed to interesting plants and things that weren't what I was seeing being sold? And that brought me to public gardens and to botanic gardens and arboreta. And as soon as I had really gotten into that world, I knew that was the right place, and I didn't want to go back to commercial horticulture. And so that's translated into a pretty successful career now, 23 years in the making, in public gardens. And I've been fortunate to work for some really wonderful institutions: the National Arboretum in DC, Wave Hill in New York for 6 years, Brooklyn Botanic Gardens for 14 years, and now Native Plant Tust for the last 5 and counting.
Excellent. Can you tell us a little bit about your work at the Native Plant Trust? And was it formerly called Garden in the Woods, or is Garden in the Woods part of the Native Plant Trust?
Yeah, so Garden in the Woods is the botanic garden that Native Plant Trust operates. So we are going to be celebrating our 125th anniversary next year, and it makes us the nation's first plant conservation organization. It started all the way back in 1900, and we've been primarily a conservation organization, and then in the late 50s, early 60s, this property in Massachusetts where I work, Garden in the Woods, was given to the organization, and it became the botanic garden that it is today. So my work encompasses sort of daily operations of the botanic garden. We also operate a native plant nursery in western Massachusetts, and so we grow over, I'd say, 250 to 300 species of native plants. The majority of them grown from seed that was collected in the wild, which is another important thing for us to do. And then we partner with some regional nurseries to grow our plants on, and then we sell them, and that all sort of complements the public programs and educational opportunities that we run through the garden. I think it's a really wonderful thing for visitors to come to a beautiful garden, see plants, be inspired with them, and then be able to take one home with them to try in their own space. And so this particular job, I think, has been a really great fit for me because I've been in the native plant world for a very long time, and it's a really wonderful organization that I think has a both a regional and national impact in promoting the use of native plants in design spaces.
Excellent. It sounds like you have gardened in the mid-Atlantic when you were growing up and in your earlier career, and now you're gardening in the Northeast. What do you think are some of the biggest challenges of gardening in the Northeast, and what are some of the advantages, the best things?
Well, I think in terms of challenges, I think these are challenges that I think that all gardeners throughout the country are facing, which is a rapidly shifting climate. Last year we had one of the wettest summers, and I don't think we set out a single sprinkler to irrigate anything. This weekend was the first rain that we'd seen in over 40 days. And so for a region that typically receives 45 to 50 inches of rain a year, those long stretches are really hard on the plantings. And we're having a lot of conversations now internally about whether we should be shifting our plantings to feature plants that are more drought tolerant, or do we honor the rhododendron that's been there for 80 years and we just set ourselves up to irrigate it supplementally if needed. I know other parts of the country have long shifted to more water-wise sorts of plantings because they have to. And I think the advantage, of course, is that this region is also, we've got over 5,000 species in our flora here. And so there's a lot of really great plants that aren't commercially available yet, or not in the cultivated trade. And I think that opportunity to experiment and to see and to really bring into gardeners, into their plant palette, plants that are beautiful, they're regionally adapted, they have all of these wonderful relationships with wildlife and insects and birds and so forth. And bringing all those things together, I think, is really part of the joy of doing this work in the Northeast.
Yeah, I agree. Imagine a gardener has come to you and they would like to add more native plants to their landscape, but they're afraid it will look untidy. Are there any tips that you could give for making native plants look more tidy and intentional and well cared for, especially if someone's dealing with a homeowners association or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are. I think that I'll approach this question in two different ways. One, I think that the plants that are available to gardeners now, there's a much broader selection of plants that are available, and plant breeders and the folks that are creating cultivars of natives continue to select for plants that may be shorter or a little more stout so they don't flop so much. And I think in smaller spaces and in the right contexts, using those plants is a great choice, because you don't have to worry about things flopping over or maybe looking untidy, as it were. If you can get away with using straight species, I do think that still, from an ecological standpoint, is the gold standard. But we oftentimes work with what's available, and I don't want folks to think that using a cultivar of a native is necessarily a bad thing. In fact, I think it's something that should be celebrated, and you should feel empowered by making that decision, because you're really trying to bring in the beauty of native plants in addition to providing resources for the wildlife that remains. So I think that's a really powerful point. The second thing I would think is that making sure that your edges are tidy. All right, so it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have a straight edge and make it like a more formal design, but even a meadow, if it has a well maintained path around the edge, provides a really nice juxtaposition between a cared for space where humans have intervened, and perhaps the chaos and exuberance of what's going on in a meadow planting. So I think those are all really good ways to make sure that you get that nice compromise in the middle. And I do think that efforts and these programs like No Mow May, for example. On one hand, I think it's really great because it's bringing the conversation around what exactly a lawn is and what it lacks in terms of resources. It brings into this larger conversation that traditionally maintained lawns take a lot of water. People still put a lot of fertilizer and pesticides on their lawns, and these all have generally negative impacts on the surrounding environment. But what it does is it also talks about the acceptance of a slightly looser aesthetic, maybe a little bit more of a wild aesthetic. The other hand is that there are critics of it that say, well, that it's just performative. So you stop mowing your lawn for a month. You might get some flowers out of it, but then you go back to doing what you normally do the rest of the year. So what resources are you really providing? I think that the conversation outweighs the criticism of it only being a little blip. Because I think that as more people accept their lawn doesn't have to look like a putting green, the more they accept that you can diversify a lawn, for example, with the addition of minor bulbs, things like violets and other low-growing native plants, and you can still have something that's functional. I'm a father of 2 small boys. I need a lawn. They need a lawn, but it doesn't have to look like a putting green to me. And that also, it exposes the next generation to these ideas too, that lawns can be functional and diverse and supportive of a lot of wildlife. So the other thing on the other side is Leave the Leaves. This is another campaign that I've seen gaining a little more traction. And I think it's great too, because in the fall, and this is a whole other discussion here, but backpack blowers are the bane of my existence. All right, I know they're functional. I know they provide a service, but it's an assault on my ears, and they're constant. And what are they doing? They're taking the gift of trees. Trees give these leaves of themselves for free, and then you pay somebody to blow it away. It hurts your ears while they do it, and then they want to sell you mulch afterwards, which is another product of trees. So again, you don't have to let the leaves lay everywhere, but you can put them into the beds. And the idea that this is free, first and foremost, that it is great for the trees in terms of nutrient recycling, but even more important is that's the place where your queen bumblebees are going to overwinter, your moth caterpillars, all the things that are part of this grand cycle need a home too. And if we're so worried about neat and tidy and let's banish every leaf from my lawn, you're not going to have the pollinators. And that translates into, you want to grow your vegetables the next year, you're not going to have a whole lot of pollinators to make sure that you've got tomatoes and peppers and all those things that bumblebees love to do. So to bring it back to the conversation here, I think that both of these efforts are really wonderful because it advances this conversation, and it also advances an increasingly more ecological mindset that we're taking towards how we maintain our gardens.
I think you had mentioned too in another interview you'd done about when you're moving the leaves around, sometimes it can negatively impact existing plantings too. If you've been blowing the leaves against that same shrub every fall, eventually that shrub may decline. So if we are a little more conscious of how we're doing this, we can,
Yeah,
have a better impact.
It's also, I think the practice of observing your garden year in, year out, and if you have a space where the leaves naturally collect, and it's a deeper depth of leaves, then you plant something there that doesn't mind, that can grow strong enough and grow through it. Conversely, if you have little areas of moss where the wind patterns keep the leaves free, those are excellent places to try very small, delicate plants. that would normally be completely lost under leaf litter. What you want to, what I think is a mistake sometimes is that you want a low growing ground cover and you plant it, and then you set yourself up every year to have to rake all the leaves off so that you don't smother the plants, so you can enjoy them, and then it's like forever maintenance. That I think we could be smarter about how we do those things, and the less time you take raking is the more time you can be enjoying your garden.
Excellent. Yeah. And gardeners are such observant people. If we just use that superpower to pay attention to what nature is showing us, it can be so helpful.
Yep, you got to learn to work with the process, and it's a lifelong pursuit. I mean, that's the lovely thing about gardening is that all this knowledge is cumulative, and so you really learn year after year and season after season. Um, and and this is an important point too that I think your listeners will appreciate, that every gardener, whether they're called an expert or not, makes mistakes. I've killed lots of plants. I've been successful at growing lots of plants. There are things that I've planted that I wish I never did because I didn't know as much as I do now. And there are other things that I desperately want to grow that I have to accept I can't after many failed attempts. And that's all part of the learning process, and that's what gardening is.
Excellent. So relatable. I think we all kind of can relate to that. Growing plants, native plants from seed, is a great way to establish populations that have some natural biodiversity. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the work of the Northeast Seed Network.
I'd be very happy to. So the Northeast Seed Network is a sort of an alliance of a lot of different institutions and individuals that span the native plant supply chain. So just like other kinds of supply chains, you have different steps where there are seed collectors and seed producers. You have places that can clean the seed and package them and make them available, and then you have a whole market of end users. And so for native plant seeds, the Northeast has been rather undeveloped. Yes, there are folks out there that are collecting seed from the wild, and you have some smaller nurseries that are growing plants from seed, but the demand for native plants, particularly from the earlier beginnings before the pandemic and even after that, has really skyrocketed as the messages of why native plants are important and why you should welcome some more of these into your garden. So you're seeing a growing demand from the horticultural industry, and then there's always been this demand from the restoration industry too. So these are the folks that are going out to natural spaces and they're trying to pull out invasives and replant, functional ecosystems. And so the wisdom is that you want to use seeds as close to your project as possible because they're adapted to the conditions here. So recognizing that this was a sort of a gap, that a lot of these organizations, so Native Plant Trust, Ecological Health Network, there are Highstead Arboretum in Connecticut, folks like Reseeding Rhode Island, Wild Seed Project, which is in Maine, Eco 59 in Connecticut, Hilltop Hanover Farms, which is in Westchester County, just north of New York City. All of them we're all kind of getting together to see how we can increase the availability of native plant seed. And so this entails a lot of different activities, from making collections in the wild, using agronomic techniques like seed plots to increase the seed. So you plant it in a row like you would any other agricultural crop, and you can take a 1 ounce collection of a grass, for example, and turn that into pounds and pounds of seed over the years. And then we're going to make that available not just to nurseries to grow, so that gardeners have these kinds of plants available, but also to feed into the restoration industry. DOTs are very interested in pollinator plantings along roadsides so they can save money and not having their crews out there mowing all the time. Solar farms is another great application. I mentioned Arnold Arboretum earlier. They recently installed a solar array on the grounds of the Arboretum and have underplanted the whole thing with a beautiful low-growing pollinator mix. So they're not spending any time mowing it. It looks gorgeous and it's full of life and generating a sustainable source of electricity for the Arboretum. So a real win-win all around. So the network, like I said, is just beginning. Was formally launched last year, and so please stay tuned for more as we grow in capacity. The one thing I would remind folks is that we are bound by how fast plants grow, and so scaling this operation and certainly providing more will take several years, but there's a lot of passionate, dedicated, and smart folks working on this. So and we really hope that in about 5 years' time we'll have a sustainable supply chain, and folks will be able to grow all those plants and plant them in their gardens and roadsides and solar farms and all the other places. So I'm really excited about this because I think this is a major future initiative, not just for Native Plant Trust, but for the region in general, and has the potential for huge impact.
And I imagine that, like you said, the Northeast is a little bit behind other parts of the country, but for listeners who are in other regions, there are similar initiatives, I think, in other regions, and it's worth a search to see how close you can source native seeds to where you are personally.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, so a lot of the more well-established seed networks exist in the western part of the United States and are largely funded through the federal government in response to wildfires and other natural disasters. The Northeast does not have that much federal land. And so, as a major financial partner in these networks, they have often looked westward because that's where the demand was. And Fish and Wildlife Service, Forest Service, National Park Service are now beginning to realize that there's a similar need for federal investment for these networks, in addition to state investment and private and nonprofit investment. And so we're really excited. We've got some great partnerships already lined up with Fish and Wildlife Service and Forest Service here in the Northeast, and I think it's just an example of what's possible with federal support to really make sure nationally that we have a robust supply chain for all of the right reasons.
Yeah, what a great idea. That time has definitely come. So that's wonderful to hear about. I'd love to know a little bit more about your home garden. Do you have any favorite plants that you have recently added to your own garden?
Picking a favorite plant is it's always such a hard question. It's like being asked to pick a favorite child. So I recently I've been planting ironweed. So we're fortunate to have about an acre to garden here in Massachusetts, and my garden and the property kind of slopes down towards a wetland. So we get a good amount of sort of subsurface flow, and when we purchased the home, I noticed lots of jewelweed growing naturally, so that was a good clue that there was a good moist environment. And so I've really been impressed with ironweed because I planted a few years ago, and they are now these just really gorgeous 8-foot tall clumps covered in those beautiful purple flowers. And as I am working my way through expanding this, I've added 3 or 4 other clumps of ironweed. They're only about 4 foot tall now because I started with small plants, but I'm excited because I can see in a couple of years' time they'll be as large as the original clumps, and really just kind of ties all those planting beds together. And ironweed is, I think, a really fantastic plant too, in that it doesn't really seed around that much. They make these really nice tall clumps. It's a real sort of, architectural statement plant that rises out of the matrix of grasses and other low-growing things that I have out there. So I'd say that's my current crush at the moment. Ask me tomorrow, it might be something different, but I'm really enjoying the ironweed right now.
Very good. Which species is that? Because I know there are a few.
There are quite a lot of ironweed. So this is New York ironweed. It's not the largest one. There is a species called giant ironweed that can top out 10, 12 foot. And then the further south you go, you do pick up some more ironweed diversity. The other one that I think is a really great one for people that may not have an acre to grow in, that's a little bit smaller, is a plant from the Ozarks. It's called Vernonia lettermanii, and there's a really wonderful selection called iron butterflies. It's very available in the trade. Very, again, small, thin foliage, about 2.5 feet tall, and very drought tolerant. An excellent plant for anybody who gardens in the southeast and that's listening today.
Yes, I have that one too. That's a favorite. Love it. Absolutely. Can you think of what the most recent plant that you killed or that died on your watch is? That's a hard question, and it's a surprise question, so sorry about that.
Let me think.
Or one you wish you never planted. That might be easier.
Yeah, I mean, so I this was, and I go back to my work at Brooklyn Botanic Garden, and so I didn't have as good of an understanding of plant succession and what are called ruderal plants. So these are plants that move in first after a disturbance. So New England has a lot of old agricultural fields that were abandoned, and so there's this nice progression of things that come in, and the first plants to usually move in are shade intolerant and fairly aggressive in terms of them seeding around or growing through rhizomes. And so I planted in a more of a formal border at the Botanic Gardens what's called dog hemp, Apocynum cannabinum. And I thought, oh, this is great. It's got wildlife value. And it grew, and then the next year it popped up in a few other places, and then the year after that it kept moving further and further, and then I said, wait, this is too much, and so I attempted to remove it, and every year it would just come back again and again. And I was like, why did I put this thing in the ground? It was the wrong context for the plant. I shouldn't say that the plant itself is bad, I just say I didn't use it in the right way. And so that was one that I kind of wished I hadn't. And it's also one of the things that, when you garden somewhere for a long time, particularly in a public garden, and then you leave that place, you leave behind all of your decisions for the next person as well. And so my good friend Will took over the garden, and if you're listening, Will, I'm sorry if you're still fighting that plant. So yeah, it's ones that I've killed. Surprisingly, here at Garden in the Woods, we've struggled with rhodora. So this is a beautiful native azalea. It's called Rhododendron canadense, and has these really beautiful dark pink flowers early in the spring. And by all accounts, we should have the right kind of conditions for it here, but we just haven't been able to find it. This is one of these plants, and it kind of ties back to one of your questions about the challenges of climate change here in the Northeast. The USDA recently revised our hardiness zones, so we've all kind of ticked up half a zone. And while that's exciting for a lot of folks who want to grow, maybe figs or things from further south, the opposite of is that plants that like cool conditions, and particularly cool summer nights, so a lot of the like boreal things, balsam firs, bunchberry, these really wonderful native plants, they struggle in our conditions now. And so it's getting harder and harder to cultivate those kinds of plants. And I think Rhodora falls into that category too. I can go to a beautiful bog up in Maine and see it in its full glory, and I just can't get it to grow in Massachusetts. So we'll keep trying. We'll try a few other spaces. I'm not ready to give up completely yet. But it is one of those things that after trying a bunch of times, you just kind of accept that maybe we just can't grow that one. It's a hard lesson.
It is a hard lesson yes, never give up.
Yeah, or try something new. I mean, there's, that all depends on how you spin your perspective. So
absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. And again, for any listeners that want to see the full plant list or photos, finegardening.com, click on the podcast tab. Thanks again, Uli.
You're very welcome, Carol. This was a great conversation. Thank you so much for having me on.